A white judge slaps a black girl in court, thinking he holds all the power, but he has no idea. He just assaulted the daughter of his own boss. Now, as the world watches, his past corruption unravels, and one question remains. Will he finally face the justice he denied so many times? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the stark courthouse hallway as Judge William Alderman's voice boomed through the heavy wooden doors. Ava Winton sat on a hard bench outside, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Her best friend, Maya Johnson, sat close beside her, their shoulders touching in silent support. "Your Honor, if I could just explain," came a man's desperate voice from inside. "I've heard enough," Judge Alderman's sharp tone cut through the air. 20 years for armed robbery. Next case." Ava's stomach clenched as she heard the man's family crying inside. Maya squeezed her hand. "It's going to be okay, Ava. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know I didn't," Ava whispered, her voice shaking. "I was just looking at that necklace in the store. I never even touched it." She blinked back tears, remembering how the security guard had roughly grabbed her arm, ignoring her protests. The courtroom doors swung open, and a young black man was led out in handcuffs, his head bowed. His mother followed, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Ava felt her heart skip a beat. Inside the courtroom, Judge Alderman sat high on his bench, his steel gray hair and black robes making him look like a stern bird of prey. His cold eyes swept over the room as he shuffled papers, barely glancing at the next defendant, a middle-aged black woman accused of a minor traffic violation. "Your Honor," the woman began, "I was trying to get my sick child to the hospital." "Mrs. Thompson," Alderman interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. "I've seen your type before. You people always have excuses." He peered down at her over his reading glasses. "Maximum fine. Next case." The court clerk, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, called out, "Winton, Ava." Maya gave Ava's hand one final squeeze. "Remember what your dad said. Keep calm and tell the truth." Ava stood on shaky legs, smoothing her neat blue dress, the one her father had bought her for church. She walked into the courtroom, feeling Judge Alderman's dismissive gaze sweep over her. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher inside, making everything look flat and unreal. "Another shoplifting case," Alderman muttered, not even looking at the file. "Let me guess. You were just looking at the item? Never intended to steal it?" "That's right, Your Honor," Ava said clearly, just as she'd practiced. "I was admiring the necklace through the glass case." "Save it," Alderman cut her off, waving his hand. "The security footage shows you lingering suspiciously. I see cases like yours every day." Ava felt her face burn. "Sir, if you'd just watched the whole video." "Young lady," Alderman's voice grew sharp. "I've been on this bench for 30 years. I know exactly what I'm looking at." He leaned forward, his expression hard. "Your generation needs to learn about consequences. Maybe some time in juvenile detention will—" "But I'm innocent," Ava burst out, immediately regretting her outburst as Alderman's face darkened. "Contempt," he barked, banging his gavel. "I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect in my courtroom." Through the ringing in her ears, Ava heard Maya gasp from the gallery. The court clerk looked down at her desk, her shoulders tense. Ava stood frozen, feeling the weight of injustice pressing down on her like a physical force. Judge Alderman glared at her over his reading glasses, his mouth set in a thin line of disapproval. "Unless you'd like to make your situation worse, young lady, I suggest you remain silent while I consider your sentence." Ava's throat felt tight, but she lifted her chin, meeting the judge's cold stare. She might be scared, but she wouldn't let him see her break. Her father had taught her better than that. The tension in courtroom 4B was thick enough to cut with a knife. Prosecutor Elliot Spencer rose from his seat, his expensive suit crisp and perfect, as he approached the bench with an air of casual indifference. "Your Honor," Spencer drawled, holding up a USB drive, "we have security footage clearly showing the defendant's suspicious behavior at Morton's Jewelry." He gestured to a small TV cart that a bailiff wheeled forward. The grainy footage showed Ava standing near a glass display case. The video jumped and skipped, showing only fragments of her movements. Ava's heart pounded as she watched. They'd cut out all the parts where the sales associate had been helping her. As you can see, Spencer continued, the defendant spent nearly 15 minutes circling the display cases, clearly casing the establishment. Angela Martinez, Ava's public defender, stood up quickly. Your Honor, this footage has clearly been edited. We request to see the complete video. Judge Alderman barely glanced at Angela. The evidence speaks for itself, Counselor. Continue, Mr. Spencer. Spencer smiled smoothly. The security guard witnessed the defendant attempting to open the display case. That's not true, Ava burst out, then immediately pressed her lips together as Alderman's gaze snapped to her. Young lady, he growled. One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. Again. Angela placed a gentle hand on Ava's arm. Your Honor, my client has no prior record. She's an honor student at Lincoln High School with a 4.0 GPA. The security guard didn't even find any merchandise on her person. Ms. Martinez, Alderman's voice dripped with condescension. Your client's academic achievements don't excuse her behavior. The footage clearly shows… Angela interrupted firmly. The footage shows a young woman looking at jewelry. Nothing more. And if the court would allow us to present the complete, unedited video… Alderman's face reddened. That's enough, Ms. Martinez. I won't have you questioning the integrity of evidence presented in my courtroom. Ava watched as Angela's jaw tightened, but the attorney kept her voice steady. Then I move to dismiss this case due to lack of evidence. The prosecution has presented nothing but edited footage and the word of a security guard who isn't even here to testify. Spencer cleared his throat. The guard is on vacation, Your Honor, but his written statement is hearsay, Angela finished. We can't cross-examine a piece of paper. Judge Alderman shuffled papers on his bench, barely concealing his impatience. Motion to dismiss denied. Now, if we could proceed without further interruptions… Ava felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She stood straighter, remembering her father's words about dignity in the face of injustice. Your Honor, she said quietly, respectfully, could I please explain what happened? Alderman sighed heavily. Make it quick. I was looking at a necklace for my mother's birthday. The sales associate, Mrs. Chen, was helping me. She even took it out of the case to show me. I was saving up to buy it. Ava's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. That's why I was there so long. I was trying to decide if I had enough money saved. A likely story, Spencer muttered. Angela stood again. We can subpoena Mrs. Chen to testify. Enough! Alderman's gavel cracked against the wood. I've heard all I need to hear. This is a clear case of attempted theft, and your continued disruptions, Ms. Martinez, are not helping your client. The court clerk looked uncomfortable as she typed, her fingers hesitating over the keys. Even some of the bailiffs shifted uneasily. Your Honor, Angela tried one more time, at least allow us to present character witnesses. Ava's teachers are willing to testify. Ms. Martinez, Alderman's voice was deadly quiet. You are dangerously close to contempt yourself. This court has been more than patient with your theatrics. Ava watched as her attorney's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. The injustice of it all made her chest tight, but she held her head high. She wouldn't give Alderman the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Spencer leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched the scene unfold. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the courtroom as Judge Alderman prepared to deliver his ruling. Judge Alderman leaned forward on his bench, a patronizing smile spreading across his face. The fluorescent lights cast deep shadows under his eyes, making him look almost sinister. Miss Winton, he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. Perhaps we can make this easier on everyone. If you simply admit what you did and show some remorse, I might be inclined to be more lenient. The courtroom fell silent. Ava could feel everyone's eyes on her. The court reporter's fingers frozen over her keyboard, the bailiffs shifting uncomfortably, and the few reporters in the back scribbling in their notepads. Angela touched Ava's arm gently. You don't have to. Let the girl speak for herself, Alderman snapped, then turned his attention back to Ava. Well, what do you say? A simple guilty plea, and this could all be over. Ava stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their slight trembling. She thought of her father's words about truth and dignity, about never compromising who you are. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. I won't say I did something I didn't do. The smile vanished from Alderman's face. His features twisted into something ugly, decades of unchecked power and prejudice bubbling to the surface. The courtroom temperature seemed to drop several degrees. You ungrateful, he sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of red. Without warning, he stood up, his robes swishing as he stepped down from the bench. Angela rose quickly. Your Honor, I must object to… But Alderman was already striding toward Ava, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent courtroom. He stopped directly in front of her, towering over her small frame. You think you can come into my courtroom and make a mockery of justice? He hissed. Before anyone could react, Alderman's hand flew through the air. The crack of his palm against Ava's cheek echoed through the courthouse like a gunshot. Gasps erupted throughout the room. Several phones shot up, their cameras capturing the moment. The court reporter's hands flew to her mouth. Even Elliot Spencer, the prosecutor, stood up in shock. Ava stumbled backward, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. How dare you? Angela's voice thundered through the courtroom as she rushed to stand between Ava and the judge. This is assault. You just struck a minor in full view of dozens of witnesses. The bailiffs finally snapped out of their shocked stupor, moving toward the scene. Phones continued recording as reporters rushed to the front of the courtroom, their cameras flashing. Alderman seemed to realize what he'd done. His face drained of color as he looked at his hand, then at the phones recording his every move. The power he'd wielded so carelessly for years suddenly felt very fragile. Order! Order in my court, he shouted, but his voice cracked. For the first time, fear flickered across his face as he saw his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. This court is a circus, Angela announced loudly, making sure the reporters could hear. My client, a minor, has just been physically assaulted by a sitting judge. This is a clear demonstration of the bias and abuse of power that's been happening in this courtroom for years. The courtroom had erupted into chaos. Court staff stood frozen at their stations. Witnesses and other defendants pressed against the walls, and reporters pushed forward, their questions overlapping. Judge Alderman, did you just strike a teenage defendant? How long have you been physically abusing defendants? Is this standard practice in your courtroom? Through it all, Ava remained standing, her head held high despite the red mark blooming on her cheek. Her quiet dignity in the face of such a public assault spoke volumes more than any outburst could have. The chaos in courtroom 7B reached a fever pitch. Papers rustled, voices overlapped, and camera phones continued recording as Judge Alderman tried to regain control of his domain. His face had shifted from shock to a practiced mask of indifference, as if striking a teenage defendant was just another day at court. Order! I said order! Alderman's voice boomed through the room. He straightened his robes and began walking back to his bench, acting as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Angela Martinez wasn't having it. She stood protectively next to Ava, her normally professional demeanor replaced by righteous fury. Your Honor, you just committed assault against my client, a minor, in full view of this entire courtroom. This cannot be ignored. Watch your tone, Counselor, Alderman warned, settling back into his chair. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. Contempt? Angela's laugh was sharp and bitter. With all due respect, Your Honor, you just struck my 16-year-old client. This goes far beyond contempt of court. The elderly bailiff, Tom Wilson, who had served in this courthouse for over 2 decades, approached the bench. His weathered face showed genuine concern as he leaned in close to Alderman. Your Honor, he whispered urgently, do you know who her father is? Alderman waved him away dismissively, too caught up in his own authority to heed the warning. Step back, Wilson. I'm handling this. Outside the courthouse, the video was already making its rounds. Phones buzzed with notifications as the shocking footage spread across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The clip showed the moment in crystal clarity. A middle-aged white judge in his robes striking a composed black teenage girl who had simply maintained her innocence. Back in the courtroom, reporters pressed forward, their questions growing more insistent. "Judge Alderman, will you be stepping down from the bench? Is this standard procedure in your courtroom? How many other defendants have you assaulted?" Ava stood quietly through it all, her cheeks still stinging. She could feel her phone vibrating constantly in her pocket, no doubt filling with messages from friends and family who had already seen the video. The pain in her face was nothing compared to the burning in her chest, a mixture of humiliation, anger, and determination. Angela pulled out her own phone, her eyes widening as she scrolled. "Your Honor, this incident is already viral. Justice for Ava is trending. There are calls for your immediate suspension." "This court does not operate based on social media trends, Ms. Martinez," Alderman snapped, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. The first cracks in his facade were beginning to show. More courthouse staff had filtered into the room, drawn by the commotion. The court clerk was on the phone, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The courthouse security guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure whether they should be protecting the judge or the teenage defendant he had just assaulted. "Your Honor," Angela's voice cut through the chaos, "I am formally requesting an immediate mistrial and your recusal from this case. I'm also informing you that we will be filing charges for assault on a minor." Alderman's face flushed again. "You're out of line, counselor. This court dash." "This court has just witnessed you commit a crime," Angela interrupted, her voice steady and clear. "And unlike the baseless charges against my client, we have this one on video from multiple angles." Outside, the crowd gathering on the courthouse steps grew larger by the minute. News vans began pulling up, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky. The story was spreading like wildfire, and William Alderman's carefully constructed world of unchecked power was about to face its reckoning. Inside, the judge's hands gripped his gavel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had weathered complaints before, had brushed off accusations of bias, but this was different. This time, there was undeniable proof, and it was playing on thousands of screens across the country. The next morning dawned cold and gray over the courthouse. William Alderman straightened his tie as he strode through the familiar marble halls, trying to project his usual air of authority despite the churning in his stomach. The video of yesterday's incident had exploded overnight, and his phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from reporters. He approached the conference room, noting the unusual number of senior staff gathered outside. Their faces were grim, and conversations died as he passed. The courthouse administrator, Patricia Wells, opened the door for him with a curt nod. "They're waiting for you inside, Judge Alderman." The moment he stepped into the room, the air seemed to freeze. Seated at the head of the long mahogany table was Chief Justice Malcolm Winton, his presence commanding even in silence. Alderman had seen Winton at various judicial functions over the years, but had never been in such close proximity to him. The blood drained from Alderman's face as recognition dawned. The resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable. The same determined set of the jaw, the same dignified bearing. His legs suddenly felt weak. "Have a seat, Judge Alderman." Winton's voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. Alderman lowered himself into a chair, his usual swagger deserting him. The room was packed with courthouse officials and members of the Judicial Review Board, all watching with barely concealed tension. "I've reviewed the footage from yesterday's proceedings," Winton began, his words measured and precise. "Multiple angles, multiple recordings. I've also examined Ms. Martinez's formal complaint and the statements from courthouse staff." He paused, his dark eyes boring into Alderman. "But before we address any of that, I want to make something absolutely clear." Winton leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "You didn't just slap a child. You assaulted my daughter." The words fell like hammer blows in the silent room. Alderman's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "My 16-year-old daughter," Winton continued, his voice growing harder with each word, "who was maintaining her innocence against charges that, upon review, appear to have been fabricated. The security footage from the store clearly shows her leaving without taking anything, yet somehow that portion was conveniently edited out of the prosecution's evidence. Sweat began to bead on Alderman's forehead. "Chief Justice Winton, I had no idea she was your—" "That's precisely the point, isn't it?" Winton cut him off. "You didn't know who she was connected to, so you felt free to treat her like every other black defendant who's had the misfortune to enter your courtroom. The only difference is that this time your actions were caught on camera." Alderman's face flushed red. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Winton's voice thundered through the room. "I've spent the morning reviewing your case history. The pattern of discriminatory sentencing is staggering. Black defendants consistently receiving maximum sentences while white defendants get minimal penalties for the same crimes. Cases dismissed against white defendants despite strong evidence, while black defendants are convicted on circumstantial evidence." The Chief Justice stood slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the table. "You've been operating under the assumption that your position makes you untouchable. That ends today. The Judicial Review Board has already begun proceedings for your immediate suspension, pending a full investigation of your conduct." Alderman's hands gripped the arms of his chair. This is a witch hunt. One unfortunate incident." "Unfortunate incident?" Winton's laugh was cold and sharp. "You struck a minor in open court. You violated every ethical principle our profession stands for, and you did it because you thought you could get away with it, just like you've gotten away with your prejudiced rulings for years." The room remained deathly quiet as Winton pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. "This contains testimony from dozens of defendants who've passed through your courtroom. We're going to examine every single case, every ruling, every sentence, and when we're done, you won't just lose your position on the bench, you'll face criminal charges." Outside the courthouse, a sea of protesters filled the streets. Their signs bobbed up and down like waves, bearing messages like, "Justice for Ava" and "End judicial racism now." The morning sun cast long shadows across their determined faces as they chanted in unison, their voices echoing off the building's stone facade. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Reporters stood before cameras, their microphones held steady as they delivered updates to viewers across the nation. The video of Judge William Alderman striking 16-year-old Ava Winton has now been viewed over 10 million times, one reporter announced, her voice clear and professional. Social media has exploded with the hashtag number Justice for Ava, which is currently trending nationwide. Inside her home, Ava sat on the couch watching the coverage with a mix of emotions. Her hand unconsciously touched her cheek where Alderman had struck her. The memory still stung, but seeing the overwhelming support from strangers gave her a warm feeling in her chest. Her father sat beside her, his phone buzzing constantly with messages and calls. Malcolm Winton's face appeared on the TV screen as footage played from his press conference earlier that morning. "The investigation into Judge Alderman's conduct will be thorough and transparent," Malcolm's recorded voice rang out. "We've already uncovered disturbing patterns in his sentencing history. Black defendants in his courtroom received sentences that were, on average, 3 times longer than white defendants for the same crimes." The camera cut to Alderman trying to leave the courthouse, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. His face was red with anger and shame as security guards helped him push through the crowd. "No comment," he kept shouting, holding his briefcase in front of his face like a shield. Back at the protest, people from all walks of life had gathered. There were lawyers in suits standing shoulder to shoulder with students in jeans. Elderly women held signs next to young mothers with children in strollers. The crowd had swelled to fill several blocks. "What do we want?" a young woman with a megaphone called out. "Justice," the crowd roared back. "When do we want it?" "Now." Social media feeds were flooded with the video of Alderman striking Ava. Each share came with new calls for action, new demands for change. Legal experts appeared on news shows, explaining the significance of the case. "This isn't just about one judge or one incident," a distinguished law professor explained on a major network. "This is about exposing the systemic bias that exists in our justice system. What happened to Ava Winton happens to countless others. They just don't usually have it caught on camera." Malcolm Winton's office was working overtime, reviewing hundreds of cases. Staff members wheeled in cart after cart of files, each one containing stories of lives affected by Alderman's prejudiced rulings. "Look at this one," an assistant said, holding up a file. "A 19-year-old black student got 5 years for possession of marijuana. 2 weeks later, a white defendant with the same charge got probation." Malcolm nodded grimly, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. His phone buzzed again. Another news outlet requesting an interview. But his focus remained on the task at hand. Each file represented someone's life, someone's future that had been altered by Alderman's bias. Outside, the protests continued to grow. People shared stories of their own experiences with judicial discrimination. Some cried as they spoke, finally feeling heard after years of silence. Others listened with growing determination to see real change. "This ends now," a community leader addressed the crowd. "Ava Winton's bravery in standing up to that judge has given us all a voice. We won't be silent anymore." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the scene of thousands of people united in their demand for justice. The hashtag number sign, Justice for Ava, continued to spread, reaching millions around the country, turning one brave girl's stand against injustice into a national movement for change. Judge William Alderman sat in his chambers, his tie loosened and his jacket thrown carelessly over a leather chair. The large TV mounted on his wall played news coverage of the protests, casting a flickering blue light across his flushed face. He grabbed the remote and turned up the volume, his lips curling into a sneer. "Look at them," he muttered to himself, watching the crowds outside the courthouse. "Acting like this is the crime of the century." He reached for his glass of scotch, the ice cubes clinking as his hand trembled slightly. The news anchor's voice filled the room. The protests have entered their second day, with thousands gathering to demand justice for Ava Winton, the 16-year-old who was struck by Judge William Alderman during her hearing. "Internet hysteria," Alderman scoffed, taking a long sip. "They'll forget about it by next week. They always do." The screen changed to show Chief Justice Malcolm Winton standing at a podium, his presence commanding even through the television. Alderman's hand tightened around his glass. "Our investigation has already revealed deeply troubling patterns in Judge Alderman's courtroom," Malcolm Winton announced, his voice steady and authoritative. "We're reviewing every case he's presided over in the past decade. Every ruling, every sentence, every dismissal will be scrutinized." Alderman's confidence flickered for the first time. He'd seen that look in Malcolm Winton's eyes before, the same unwavering determination that had helped him become the youngest Chief Justice in the state's history. The sharp ring of his phone cut through the room, making him jump. He glanced at the caller ID, Judge Patricia Reynolds, a senior member of the Judicial Review Board. His finger hovered over the screen before he answered. "Patricia," he said, trying to sound casual, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Cut the act, William." Her voice was cold, professional. "I'm calling as a courtesy, given our long history together. This investigation isn't going away." Alderman forced a laugh. "Come on, Patricia. We both know how these things work. A few weeks of bad press, maybe a formal reprimand." "No, William, you don't understand." She cut him off. "This is different. The video of you striking that girl has over 15 million views. The Chief Justice himself is leading the investigation. We're looking at serious ethics violations, patterns of discrimination, abuse of power." "Nonsense," he interrupted, but his voice cracked slightly. "I've served on this bench for 25 years. You can't—" "We can and we will," Patricia said firmly. "The evidence is damning, William. Your sentencing records alone. The disparities are impossible to justify. You're looking at permanent removal from the bench. Possible criminal charges, your pension, your reputation, everything is on the line." Alderman's hand shook as he poured himself another drink, spilling some on his desk. "This is ridiculous. One little incident and suddenly everyone's acting like I'm—" "One incident caught on camera," Patricia corrected him. "But we both know this isn't isolated. The numbers don't lie, William. Black defendants in your courtroom consistently received sentences 3 times longer than white defendants for identical crimes. That's not justice. That's prejudice wearing a robe." Alderman stared at the TV where footage now showed protesters holding signs with his face crossed out. His own words from countless hearings echoed in his mind, but for the first time they sounded different to him. Harsh, biased, cruel. Still, he couldn't admit it, wouldn't admit it. "They can't touch me," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I've weathered worse storms than this." "No, you haven't," Patricia replied quietly. "Not like this. Consider this call a warning, William. The world is changing, and your time of being untouchable is over." The line went dead, leaving Alderman alone with the sound of protesters chanting outside his window and Malcolm Winton's voice from the TV, methodically laying out the case against him. Malcolm Winton sat at his dining room table, surrounded by stacks of case files, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully reviewed yet another troubling ruling from Judge Alderman. The evening light cast long shadows across the papers, but he couldn't stop working, not when justice was at stake. "Malcolm," Evelyn's soft voice called from the kitchen. "You need to eat something. It's past 8. He looked up to see his wife carrying a plate of sandwiches. Her face showed the same worry lines that had been there since the incident. "Thank you, dear," he said, moving some files aside to make space. "How bad is it?" Evelyn asked, sitting beside him. Malcolm shook his head, his expression grim. "Worse than we thought. The investigation team has gone through just 3 years of his cases so far, and the pattern is crystal clear. Black defendants consistently received maximum sentences, while white defendants got minimal punishment or probation for the same crimes. It's not just about the numbers anymore," he continued, pulling out a specific file. "Look at his written opinions, the language he uses. These people, your kind, typical behavior, it's all there in black and white." Evelyn placed her hand over his. "And how's our baby girl doing?" Malcolm's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the worried father beneath. "She won't come out of her room again today. Says she can't face going back to school." "I tried talking to her earlier," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "She keeps watching that video of herself getting slapped. Over and over. Says she feels like everyone's seen her at her weakest moment." "Our strong, beautiful girl," Malcolm whispered, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. "She didn't deserve any of this." The sound of the evening news drifted in from the living room. A reporter was interviewing Sarah Chen, one of Ava's classmates outside their high school. "Ava? She's like the smartest person I know," Sarah's voice carried through the house. "She tutors kids after school, volunteers at the animal shelter every weekend. She's never even had a detention." Another student, Marcus Williams, appeared on screen. "When I heard she was accused of shoplifting, I knew it had to be wrong. Ava's the one who convinced me to join the debate team. She's always talking about wanting to be a lawyer like her dad." Malcolm and Evelyn moved to the living room, watching as more of Ava's teachers and classmates came forward to defend her character. "Advanced placement everything," Mrs. Rodriguez, Ava's English teacher, stated firmly. "President of the student council. The idea that she's some kind of troublemaker is absolutely ridiculous." The story cut to footage of the investigation team entering the courthouse, boxes of files being wheeled in on carts. The reporter's voice explained, "Chief Justice Winton has assembled a team of 12 investigators to review Judge Alderman's past rulings, focusing on potential racial bias and discrimination." "The support helps," Evelyn said softly, "but it doesn't erase what happened to her." They heard footsteps on the stairs and Ava appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. Without a word, both parents opened their arms, and she walked into their embrace. "I heard what my friends said," she whispered against her father's shoulder. "They're telling the truth about who you really are," Malcolm said, holding his daughter close. "And that truth is going to help us make sure this never happens to anyone else." "The investigation team found 3 more cases just today," he continued gently. "Young people just like you, who didn't get a fair hearing in Alderman's courtroom. Your story is giving them courage to come forward." Ava pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. "Really?" "Really," Malcolm confirmed. Sometimes it takes one person standing up to show others they can stand too. Evelyn brushed Ava's hair back from her face. You don't have to go back to school until you're ready, sweetheart. But remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You stood up for what was right. The TV continued to play in the background, showing more students and teachers speaking out in support of Ava, while investigators wheeled another cart of files into the courthouse. Judge William Alderman strode into the courthouse with his usual air of superiority, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, but something felt different. The usual bustle of activity seemed muted, and the courthouse staff scurried away as he approached. "Morning, Patricia," he called out to his regular clerk. She kept her head down, pretending to shuffle papers. Her shoulders tensed visibly as she mumbled something unintelligible and hurried away. Frowning, Alderman made his way to his courtroom. The door was locked. A notice had been taped to it. All cases reassigned to courtroom 4B, Judge Henderson presiding. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the hallway. Nobody answered. A young intern practically ran in the opposite direction. The wall-mounted TV in the corridor caught his attention. Angela Martinez's face filled the screen, her expression fierce and determined. Judge Alderman's actions weren't just an assault on an innocent teenager, she was saying. They were a disturbing glimpse into the systemic bias that has plagued his courtroom for years. We're calling for his immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Alderman's face reddened as he watched. The caption below read, "Public Defender demands justice. #, Justice for Ava movement gains national attention." He pulled out his phone and dialed Elliot Spencer's number. After 3 rings, the prosecutor answered. "Meet me in the law library, now," Alderman barked. 10 minutes later, in the dusty quiet of the empty law library, Alderman paced between the towering shelves. "This will blow over," he insisted, as Elliot Spencer watched him nervously. "The media always needs something new to cry about. Next week, they'll have forgotten all about this." Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't think so, Bill, not this time. Have you seen the investigation team? They're going through everything, every single case." "So what?" Alderman scoffed. "My rulings were all by the book." "Were they?" Elliot's voice was quiet but pointed. "Because I've been looking back at our cases together. The sentencing disparities, they're pretty hard to explain." Alderman stopped pacing. "Are you turning on me now, Elliot? After all these years?" "I have a career to think about," Elliot said, standing up. "A family. I can't be associated with—" He gestured vaguely at Alderman. "This. Associated?" Alderman's voice rose. "You were right there with me. Every case, every ruling." "Lower your voice," Elliot hissed, glancing around. "Look, I'm trying to help you here. The walls are closing in. Malcolm Winton isn't just some angry father. He's the Chief Justice. He has the power to make this stick. I've been on this bench for 23 years, Alderman said, his voice trembling with rage. You think they can just— They can, Elliot cut him off. And they will. The footage is everywhere. Social media, national news, and now with this investigation. He shook his head. I'm sorry, Bill. You're on your own. Alderman watched in disbelief as Elliot walked away, leaving him alone among the law books. Through the library windows, he could see reporters gathering outside the courthouse. Their cameras glinted in the morning sun like predators' eyes. Back in the hallway, he caught another glimpse of the TV. Angela Martinez was still speaking. This isn't just about one incident. This is about years of injustice. How many lives have been affected by Judge Alderman's bias? How many futures has he damaged with his prejudiced rulings? The few people in the hallway gave him a wide berth as he walked past, their eyes averted, their whispers following him like shadows. The courthouse that had been his domain for over 2 decades suddenly felt alien and hostile. His secretary's desk was empty, a small note propped against her computer screen. Out sick today. Alderman knew better. She wouldn't be coming back. The warm studio lights cast a gentle glow on Ava Winton's face as she sat beside her father on the plush interview couch. The famous news anchor, Sarah Chen, leaned forward with compassionate eyes. Thank you for being here today, Ava. Sarah said softly. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Ava's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Malcolm Winton placed his hand over hers and she took a deep breath. "I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad," Ava began, her voice quiet but steady. "That maybe I was making too much of it. But then I realized that's exactly what people like Judge Alderman count on. They want us to stay quiet." Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell us about that moment in the courtroom?" Ava's eyes grew distant. "I was just trying to tell my side of the story. I hadn't stolen anything. I had witnesses, proof." She swallowed hard. "But he wouldn't let me finish a single sentence. It was like he decided who I was before I even opened my mouth." Malcolm squeezed her hand, his jaw tight with controlled emotion. "And then he hit you," Sarah said gently. "Yes." Ava's voice cracked slightly. "I remember the sound more than the pain. The whole courtroom went silent, and in that moment, I saw exactly who he was, a bully who thought he could get away with anything." Across town, William Alderman sat in his darkened living room, watching the interview through narrowed eyes. His fingers gripped the remote so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Turn it off, William," Sharon Alderman said from the doorway, her voice tired. "You're only torturing yourself." "Did you hear what she's saying about me?" he snarled, gesturing at the screen. "Making me sound like some kind of monster." On the TV, Malcolm Winton was speaking now, his deep voice resonating with controlled anger. "No child should ever feel unsafe in a courtroom. These are supposed to be places of justice, not intimidation. What Judge Alderman did to my daughter is just the tip of the iceberg." Sharon moved into the room, her face lined with worry. "They have video evidence, William. The whole world saw what you did." "It was a moment of frustration. These kids today, they have no respect." "Stop it." Sharon's voice cracked like a whip. "Just stop. I've watched you spiral deeper into this hatred over the years. I kept quiet. I told myself it wasn't my place to question a judge. But this time?" She shook her head. "You can't escape this one." Back on the screen, Ava was speaking again, her voice stronger now. "I want other kids to know they don't have to be afraid. If someone in power treats you wrong, speak up. There are people who will listen, who will fight for you." The camera panned to show photos of the protests outside the courthouse, crowds holding signs reading, "Justice for Ava" and "End Judicial Bias." "The support has been overwhelming," Malcolm added. "People from all walks of life are coming forward with their own stories about facing prejudice in Judge Alderman's courtroom." William muted the TV, his face ashen. His phone buzzed. Another news alert. The hashtag #sign Justice for Ava was trending worldwide, with millions of shares and comments. "I told you to be careful," Sharon said quietly. "All those years I warned you about letting your prejudices affect your rulings. Now it's all coming out, William. Every case, every harsh sentence, every time you dismissed evidence because you'd already made up your mind about someone based on their race." "You don't understand," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. On the silent TV screen, Ava Winton stood tall, her father's arm around her shoulders as they left the studio. The crawler beneath showed the interview was already going viral, with over 1 million views in just 30 minutes. Sharon watched her husband sink deeper into his chair, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the television. "No, William," she said softly. "I understand perfectly. But this time you've gone too far, and there's no coming back from it." The investigator's office buzzed with activity as they pored over case files spanning Judge Alderman's career. Stacks of manila folders covered every surface, each one representing a life potentially ruined by prejudice and bias. "Chief Justice Winton," called out Lisa Chen, the lead investigator. "You need to see this." Her voice trembled slightly as she held up a thick folder. "We've found 15 cases where Judge Alderman sentenced black defendants with either circumstantial or completely fabricated evidence." Malcolm Winton's face darkened as he examined the documents. 15 lives, he muttered, his fingers tracing the names on the files. 15 families torn apart, But it was the next revelation that made his blood run cold. Another investigator, James Torres, burst into the room, waving a USB drive. "Sir, we've got something on your daughter's case. The security footage, it's been doctored." The team gathered around a computer screen as Torres played both the original and edited versions side by side. The differences were stark. The edited version, used in court, showed Ava slipping something into her bag. The original footage showed something entirely different. The store manager, Thomas Reed, deliberately planting items in Ava's backpack while she browsed the shelves. "This isn't just tampering with evidence," Malcolm said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This is a deliberate frame-up." Further investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Thomas Reed had been involved in multiple incidents of racial profiling, but complaints against him had mysteriously disappeared. The store's corporate office had received numerous reports about his behavior, all of which had been buried. When confronted with the evidence, Reed broke down almost immediately. "Judge Alderman, he's my wife's cousin," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "He said if I ever had any trouble with certain customers, he'd make sure it was handled properly in court." The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. It wasn't just bias, it was conspiracy. Malcolm Winton sat in his office later that day, staring at the mounting evidence before him. His phone buzzed. It was Ava. "Dad," her voice was small. "Is it true? About the video?" "Yes, sweetheart," he replied gently. "We have proof now. You were set up." There was a long pause on the other end. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew I wasn't crazy." Malcolm's heart ached at the relief in his daughter's voice. How many others had doubted themselves after facing Alderman's prejudice? He made his decision. Walking into the courthouse the next morning, Malcolm Winton carried himself with the full authority of his position as Chief Justice. He found Alderman in his chambers, still acting as if nothing could touch him. "William," Malcolm's voice was ice cold, "we have evidence of your conspiracy with Thomas Reed. We have proof of tampering with evidence. We have 15 cases where you sentenced innocent people based on fabricated evidence." Alderman's face paled, but he tried to maintain his composure. "You can't prove?" "We have Reed's confession," Malcolm cut him off. "We have the original security footage. We have everything." Malcolm placed a document on Alderman's desk. "You have two choices. Step down immediately, or face criminal charges for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. And that's just the beginning." Alderman stared at the paper, his hands shaking slightly. "You're bluffing." "My daughter deserves a retrial," Malcolm continued, ignoring Alderman's comment. "As do all the others you wrongfully convicted. This isn't going away, William. The only question is how hard you want to make it on yourself." The weight of reality finally seemed to hit Alderman. His carefully constructed world of power and privilege was crumbling around him. He looked up at Malcolm, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," Malcolm said, turning to leave. "Choose wisely." The morning of the judicial hearing dawned bright and clear, but the atmosphere outside the courthouse was electric with tension. Hundreds of protesters lined the steps, their signs held high against the blue sky. "Justice for Ava," they chanted. "No more bias." Among the crowd, faces both young and old shared stories of their encounters with Judge Alderman. Sarah Thompson, a mother of 3 who'd spent 2 years in prison on false charges, held her children close as she spoke to reporters. "He didn't even look at my evidence," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He just saw my skin color and made up his mind." Inside his luxurious home across town, William Alderman paced the marble floors of his study. His hands trembled as he attempted to knot his tie for the 3rd time. The morning news played on the television, showing aerial shots of the growing crowd outside the courthouse. "Turn that damn thing off!" he shouted at his wife Sharon, who stood in the doorway watching him with worried eyes. "William, please," she pleaded. "Maybe if you just apologized." "Apologize?" He whirled around, his face red with rage. "For what? Doing my job? This is all Malcolm Winton's fault. Him and his precious daughter and their army of social media warriors? His voice rose to a scream. 25 years on the bench, and now these people want to destroy everything because of their woke agenda. Sharon flinched at his outburst. The evidence? Evidence? He laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. That's just Winton's people twisting things around. They're all in on it together. But even as the words left his mouth, his hands shook harder. The morning's paper lay on his desk, headlines screaming about the 15 cases of wrongful conviction. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from former colleagues distancing themselves. Even his country club membership had been quietly suspended. At the courthouse, Malcolm Winton stood at the window of his office, watching the crowds below. Ava sat in a chair behind him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You don't have to be here today," he said softly, turning to face his daughter. Ava lifted her chin, showing the same quiet strength that had gotten her through that terrible day in court. "Yes, I do, Dad. Not just for me, but for everyone else he hurt." The hearing room filled quickly. Civil rights activists, former defendants, and their families packed the gallery. Reporters scribbled frantically in notepads, their cameras ready to capture every moment. When Alderman finally entered, flanked by his attorneys, the room fell silent. Gone was his usual swagger, replaced by a haunted look in his eyes. He jumped at every sound, his head swiveling nervously as he took in the hostile faces around him. The evidence presentation began. Page after page of documented bias, video after video of discriminatory behavior. The doctored security footage from Ava's case played on the screen, followed by Reed's recorded confession about their conspiracy. Alderman's breathing grew more labored with each new revelation. His lawyers whispered urgently in his ear, but he seemed beyond hearing them. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal's, settling finally on Malcolm Winton's impassive face. "This is your fault," he suddenly screamed, jumping to his feet. "You and your daughter. You've turned everyone against me." His voice cracked with hysteria. "I was upholding the law. I was keeping order." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Sharon Alderman covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "Order in the room," the presiding judge commanded, banging his gavel. But Alderman wasn't finished. "The media, the protesters, all of you," he ranted, spinning in circles to address the entire room. "You're destroying everything I built." Yet beneath his rage, terror showed clearly in his eyes. The facade of the untouchable judge had crumbled completely, revealing a man who finally realized his actions had consequences. His power was gone, his reputation in tatters, and for the first time in his career, he was the one being judged. Richard Calloway's polished leather shoes clicked against the marble floor of his private office as he paced back and forth. Across from him, Judge William Alderman sat rigid in a plush leather chair, his face twisted into a scowl. "A public apology is your best option, William," Richard said, stopping to lean against his mahogany desk. "Show remorse, acknowledge your mistakes, and we might salvage something from this mess." Alderman's fist slammed down on the chair's armrest. "Remorse? For what? Maintaining order in my courtroom?" His voice trembled with barely contained rage. "I won't apologize for doing my job." Richard rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Those case reviews are being twisted to fit their narrative." Alderman shot to his feet, his face flushed. "I'm going to set the record straight. Channel 5 agreed to interview me tonight." "William, wait!" Richard called after him, but Alderman was already storming out of the office. Later that evening, under the harsh studio lights, Alderman sat across from news anchor Patricia Reynolds. Her penetrating gaze made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Judge Alderman, thank you for joining us," Patricia began, her tone professional but cool. "Let's address the incident that sparked this controversy. You physically struck a teenage girl in your courtroom. How do you justify that action?" Alderman forced a tight smile. "Now, Patricia, let's be clear about what happened. I was maintaining order." "By slapping a minor?" Patricia interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "Our viewers have all seen the video, Judge. There was no threat to order. Ms. Winton was speaking calmly and respectfully." "You weren't there," Alderman snapped. "You don't understand the context." Then help us understand, Judge, Patricia pressed. Help us understand why your sentencing records show black defendants consistently receiving harsher penalties than white defendants for identical crimes. Alderman's face reddened. Sweat beaded on his forehead under the studio lights. That's a misrepresentation of the data. We have the numbers right here, Patricia said, holding up a sheet of paper. Over your 25-year career, black defendants were 3 times more likely to receive maximum sentences in your courtroom. How do you explain that? The interview continued to spiral downward as Alderman grew more defensive and agitated. By the time it ended, his hands were shaking, and his tie felt like it was choking him. Meanwhile, across town, Ava Winton sat at her family's kitchen table, staring at the letter in her trembling hands. The words, cut from magazine letters and pasted onto plain paper, seemed to jump off the page. Drop the case or else we know where you live. Malcolm Winton stood behind his daughter, his face dark with anger as he read over her shoulder. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. This is Chief Justice Winton. I need additional security at my residence immediately. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. And get me Detective Morris from Violent Crimes. Within an hour, 2 unmarked police cars were parked on their street, and security personnel patrolled the perimeter of their property. Inside, Malcolm sat with Ava on their living room couch, his arm around her shoulders. We're not letting them intimidate you, he said softly. You're safe, and we're going to find out who sent this. Ava nodded, but her hands still trembled slightly. I know, Dad, She took a deep breath. I never thought standing up for the truth would be this scary. Malcolm pulled her closer. That's exactly why we have to keep standing up. Because people like Alderman count on fear to keep their power. He looked out the window at the security team making their rounds. But they don't get to win. Not this time. Angela Martinez strode purposefully through the courthouse corridor, a thick manila folder tucked under her arm. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she made her way to the clerk's office. The folder contained what she'd been working on for weeks, a meticulously prepared motion for Ava's retrial, complete with the newly discovered evidence about the store manager's tampering. Inside the clerk's office, she placed the documents on the counter with quiet confidence. Motion for retrial in the Winton case, she announced, her voice steady and clear. The clerk, who had been following the case closely like everyone else, gave a small nod of recognition. We've been expecting this, Ms. Martinez. 2 days later, in the Winton family's living room, Ava sat curled up on the couch, hugging her knees to her chest as she watched Angela explain the next steps. The motion has been granted, Angela said, her face bright with determination. We have a hearing scheduled for next Tuesday at 9 a.m. She leaned forward, making sure to meet Ava's eyes. This time, we have everything we need. The security footage, tampering, the store manager's history of racial profiling, everything. Ava's shoulders tensed visibly. The mere thought of returning to that courtroom made her stomach churn. Her hand unconsciously touched her cheek where Alderman had struck her. Malcolm Winton noticed his daughter's distress and moved to sit beside her. What's on your mind, sweetheart? I dot. Ava's voice quivered. What if it happens again? What if they don't believe me, even with the evidence? Her eyes welled with tears. I can still feel his hand on my face, Dad. I can still hear the sound it made and everyone gasping. Malcolm wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. This time is different, Ava. The whole world is watching now. No one can sweep this under the rug anymore. Angela nodded emphatically. Your father's right, and you won't be facing this alone. Look at what's happening with Alderman's former friends. She pulled out her tablet and showed them a news article. Prosecutor Elliot Spencer had publicly distanced himself from Alderman, releasing a statement expressing his shock and dismay at the judge's actions. Other courthouse officials who had once laughed at Alderman's racist jokes were now claiming they had always found his behavior concerning. They're all running scared, Angela explained, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Nobody wants to be associated with him anymore. The system protected him for years, but that protection is gone now. Ava wiped her eyes, sitting up a little straighter. But I'll have to see him again, won't I? No, Malcolm said firmly. Alderman has been removed from the case. Judge Patricia Chen will be presiding over your retrial. I've known her for years. She's one of the most fair-minded judges on the bench. Across town in his home office, William Alderman sat alone, staring at his computer screen. His email inbox was filled with messages from former colleagues, all variations of, "I need to distance myself," and "I can't be associated with this situation." Even his golf buddies had suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts for their weekly game. His phone buzzed. Another text from Elliot Spencer. "Please stop calling me. My statement stands. I can't help you anymore." Alderman's hand shook as he reached for the glass of scotch on his desk. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal as he lifted it to his lips, trying to steady his nerves. How had it all fallen apart so quickly? Just weeks ago, he had been untouchable. Now he could barely walk through the courthouse without seeing people whisper and turn away. Back in the Winton home, Ava finally uncurled herself from the couch. She stood up, smoothing down her shirt with trembling hands. "When you say the world is watching," she said slowly, looking between her father and Angela, "does that mean I can help make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" Malcolm smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's exactly what it means, baby girl. That's exactly what it means." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Elliot Spencer's office as William Alderman paced nervously across the room. He had insisted on meeting after hours when the building was nearly empty. "You have to help me, Elliot," Alderman said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "Just delay things. That's all I'm asking. Push back the retrial date. Cite some procedural issues." Spencer sat behind his desk, his face tight with tension. The prosecutor, who had once been Alderman's eager ally, now looked at him like he was a ticking bomb. "I'll take full responsibility for everything else," Alderman continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "The slap, the bias allegations, all of it. Just help me with this one thing." Spencer slowly shook his head. "It's over, William. Don't you understand that? It's all over." "Nothing's over until I say it's over." Alderman slammed his hand on Spencer's desk, making the prosecutor flinch. "Look at yourself," Spencer said quietly. "You're not even seeing reality anymore. Do you know what landed on my desk this morning?" He pulled out a thick manila envelope. "A subpoena. They want all my communications with you going back 5 years, every email, every text, every meeting note." Alderman's face went pale. "You can't." "I can and I will," Spencer cut him off. "I have a family, William, a career. I'm not going down with you." The words hit Alderman like physical blows. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking every bit his age. "We've been friends for 20 years. And for 20 years I looked the other way," Spencer admitted. "We all did. But this isn't something we can sweep under the rug anymore." As if to emphasize his point, Spencer's phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced at it, then turned his screen to show Alderman. "It's already starting." The headline read, "Breaking. Investigation reveals pattern of racial bias in Judge Alderman's rulings. Dozens of cases under review." Alderman watched as Spencer scrolled through the article. There were interviews with former defendants, black men and women who had received harsh sentences for minor offenses, a mother who had spent 2 years in jail for a parking ticket violation, a college student who had missed graduation because Alderman sentenced him to 6 months for jaywalking. James Thompson, Spencer read from the article. "Remember him? The high school teacher you gave 3 years for disturbing the peace when he was actually protecting his students from a white shooter?" Alderman's hands began to shake. "Those were all legitimate sentences." "Stop it," Spencer snapped. "Just stop. We both know what you did, what we all let you do." He stood up, gathering his things. "I'm cooperating with the investigation, William. I suggest you do the same." As Spencer moved toward the door, Alderman called out, "They'll come after you too. You know that, right?" Spencer paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Maybe. But at least I can say I finally did the right thing." He opened the door. "Go home, William. It's over." Alone in the darkening office, Alderman pulled out his phone. Every news site carried the same story. Social media was exploding with more accounts from former defendants and their families. The hashtag #Alderman victims was trending alongside #Justice for Ava. In the Winton household, Malcolm was showing the news to Ava. "See," he said gently. "You gave others the courage to speak up." Ava read through the stories, tears rolling down her cheeks. All those people. How could he do this for so long? Malcolm pulled his daughter close. "Because people like him count on our silence. But you changed that, baby girl. You showed everyone that speaking up matters." Back in Spencer's office, Alderman finally stood up on shaky legs. The building was completely silent now. As he walked through the empty corridors, his footsteps echoing, he realized that this was what it felt like to lose everything. Not just power or position, but the carefully constructed illusion that he had been right all along. The morning of Ava's retrial dawned with a buzz of anticipation. By 8 a.m., the courthouse steps were already crowded with protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for Ava" and "Stop Judicial Racism." News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal fingers. Inside, Ava sat in a small conference room with her father, Malcolm, and her attorney, Angela Martinez. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her navy blue dress for the 100th time. "Remember," Angela said gently, "just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." Malcolm squeezed his daughter's shoulder. "I'm right here with you, baby girl, the whole way." The main courtroom was packed when they entered. Every bench was filled, with reporters occupying the back rows, their pens poised over notepads. The new judge, Helena Roberts, commanded respect without Alderman's intimidation tactics. When Ava took the stand, the room fell silent. She looked so young in the witness box, but her voice was steady as she began to speak. "I went to the store to buy school supplies," she said, her words clear and measured. "I had saved up my allowance for weeks. I picked out notebooks, pencils, and a new calculator for my advanced math class." As Ava continued her testimony, security footage played on the courtroom screens. The unedited version showed her carefully selecting items, checking prices, and proceeding to the checkout counter. There was no evidence of theft. Then in court, Ava's voice wavered slightly. Judge Alderman wouldn't let me finish explaining. He kept cutting me off, talking over me like I wasn't even there. The infamous video of the slap played next. The sound of Alderman's hand striking Ava's face echoed through the courtroom. Several jurors visibly flinched. In the gallery, Malcolm Winton's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. Just before the lunch recess, Angela Martinez called an unexpected witness. The court calls Maria Thompson. A middle-aged Latina woman approached the stand. She smoothed her blazer as she sat down, her expression determined despite her obvious nervousness. "Ms. Thompson, what was your position in Judge Alderman's court?" Angela asked. "I was his clerk for 7 years, from 2016 to 2023, Maria replied. "And during that time, what did you observe about Judge Alderman's sentencing practices?" Maria took a deep breath. He had different standards for different defendants. If a white defendant came before him for a minor offense, he'd often dismiss it with a warning. But for black defendants, she paused, glancing at Ava, he'd find any reason to give them the maximum sentence. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Roberts tapped her gavel once, restoring order. "Can you provide specific examples?" Angela pressed. "There was a case in 2019, Maria continued. A white college student was caught stealing electronics worth over $500. Judge Alderman gave him community service. The very next day, a black high school student was accused of stealing a $20 shirt, with no clear evidence. Alderman sentenced her to 6 months in juvenile detention." From his seat at the defense table, Alderman's face had turned an ugly shade of red. His attorney placed a warning hand on his arm. "Did Judge Alderman ever explicitly state his reasoning for these disparate sentences?" Angela asked. "Yes," Maria's voice grew stronger. "In chambers, he would say things like, 'These people only understand one language,' or 'Someone needs to teach them a lesson.' He knew it was wrong. He made us sanitize the official records to hide the pattern." The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. Ava watched from her seat as Maria continued to detail years of systematic discrimination. Each revelation seemed to make Alderman shrink smaller in his chair, his former authority crumbling with every word. Judge Roberts called for order again, her gavel cracked sharp and decisive. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," she announced. "Court will resume at 1:45 p.m. As the courtroom began to empty, Ava caught her father's eye. Malcolm gave her a small, proud smile. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. After the recess, Angela Martinez approached the bench with quiet confidence. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she held up a USB drive. "Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence that will conclusively prove my client's innocence." Judge Roberts nodded. "Proceed, counselor." The courtroom lights dimmed as the projector whirred to life. The footage showed the store's back office, where manager Thomas Wilson sat at his computer. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard as he edited the security footage, carefully cutting and splicing segments to create a false narrative of Ava's actions. "As you can see," Angela's voice rang clear and strong, "Mr. Wilson deliberately manipulated the evidence to frame my client. The timestamp shows this editing took place just hours before the footage was submitted to the police." Gasps filled the courtroom. Ava's eyes widened as she watched the truth unfold on screen. Malcolm Winton reached for his daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. The footage continued, showing Wilson making a phone call. With the audio enhanced, his words came through clearly. "Yeah, got another one. These kids need to learn their place. Judge Alderman will know what to do with her." Chaos erupted in the courtroom. People jumped to their feet, shouting in outrage. Judge Roberts banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" In the commotion, William Alderman slipped from his chair. His face had turned ashen, and sweat beaded on his forehead. While all eyes were focused on the shocking evidence, he edged toward the side door, his shoulders hunched. "Your Honor," Angela continued once order was restored, "this evidence clearly shows a coordinated effort to falsely accuse and convict my client. We demand immediate dismissal of all charges." Judge Roberts held up her hand. "In light of this disturbing evidence, I need time to review everything that has been presented. We will take a 1-hour recess." As the judge left the bench, Alderman pushed through the back door of the courthouse. His hands shook as he fumbled for his car keys. But the sound of angry voices stopped him cold. A crowd of protesters had gathered around his black Mercedes. They held signs reading "Justice for Ava" and "End Judicial Racism." Someone spotted him, and the crowd surged forward. "There he is," a voice shouted. "The racist judge." Alderman backed against the courthouse wall, his usual arrogance replaced by naked fear. The protesters pressed closer, their voices growing louder. "You can't hide anymore. Face what you've done. Justice is coming." Security guards rushed to form a barrier between Alderman and the crowd, but the damage was done. The man who had terrorized countless defendants from his bench now cowered behind others for protection, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Back inside the courtroom, Ava sat with her father and Angela, processing what they had just witnessed. Tears streamed down her face, but these were different from the ones she'd shed after Alderman had struck her. These were tears of relief, of vindication. "It's really over?" she whispered. Malcolm wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Almost, baby, almost." Angela gathered her papers, her expression determined. "The judge will make her ruling soon. With this evidence, there's no way the charges can stand." Through the courthouse windows, they could hear the chants of the protesters growing louder, demanding accountability for years of injustice. William Alderman sat alone in his home office, staring at the television screen with hollow eyes. The news anchor's voice filled the dimly lit room. In a stunning development, Judge William Alderman has submitted his resignation following overwhelming evidence of racial bias and misconduct. His hands trembled as he held the formal resignation letter he'd signed just hours ago. The thick paper felt heavy, like a final nail in the coffin of his career. Outside, protesters still lingered, their signs casting shadows on his manicured lawn. The State Bar Association has suspended Judge Alderman's legal license pending further investigation, the anchor continued. Additionally, multiple civil rights organizations have filed class action lawsuits on behalf of defendants who faced discriminatory treatment in his courtroom. His phone buzzed with a notification from his bank. Account frozen per judicial order. Alderman's throat tightened as he scrolled through his other accounts, all frozen. Decades of wealth and power now beyond his reach. Across town, in the warm comfort of the Winton family home, Ava sat between her parents on their plush sofa. The same news report played on their television, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Light streamed through the windows and the smell of her mother's fresh-baked cookies filled the air. Former defendants are coming forward with their stories, the reporter announced, painting a picture of systematic discrimination that spanned Judge Alderman's entire career. For the first time since the incident, Ava felt her shoulders relax. A genuine smile spread across her face as she watched footage of Alderman being escorted from the courthouse, head bowed, through a sea of protesters. "You did this," Malcolm said softly, squeezing her hand. "Your courage started it all." "We did this," Ava corrected him, her smile growing wider. "Everyone who spoke up, everyone who shared their stories, we all did this together." On the screen, civil rights attorneys detailed the mounting lawsuits. The camera cut to Alderman's empty courtroom, where just weeks ago he had wielded his power like a weapon. Now that power was gone, stripped away by the very system he had abused for so long. "How does it feel?" Malcolm asked his daughter, watching her closely. Ava took a deep breath, considering the question. "Like I can breathe again," she said finally. "Like we all can." William Alderman's hands trembled as he read the official notice. The FBI letterhead seemed to mock him from the top of the page. Criminal investigation, multiple counts, assault of a minor. The words blurred together as his chest tightened. "William, you need to listen to me," Richard Calloway said, his voice sharp with urgency. The lawyer paced Alderman's living room, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled from hours of tense discussion. "They have everything. The assault is on video, the pattern of bias is documented. Your former clerk's testimony alone is enough to—" "Shut up," Alderman slammed his fist on the coffee table, making his untouched whiskey glass rattle. "I know the law better than anyone. They can't touch me." "For God's sake, William, this isn't your courtroom anymore. You need to either flee or take a plea deal. Those are your only options now." Meanwhile, across town, Ava Winton sat under bright studio lights beside her father. The CNN anchor leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. "Chief Justice Winton, what does this investigation mean for the broader judicial system?" Malcolm Winton's deep voice carried the weight of decades of experience. "It means we're finally confronting the reality of systemic bias in our courts. What happened to my daughter wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of unchecked power and deeply rooted prejudice." The anchor turned to Ava. "And how are you coping with all of this attention?" Ava straightened in her chair, her voice steady despite her nerves. "It's overwhelming sometimes, but I know this is bigger than me now. Every day, I hear from people who faced similar treatment in Judge Alderman's courtroom. They didn't have anyone to speak up for them. They didn't have the privilege of a father who could fight back." Outside the studio, protesters had gathered, their signs visible through the window. "Arrest Alderman now. No judge above the law. Justice for all." Back in Alderman's living room, Richard Calloway watched his client unravel. Alderman flipped through channels frantically, his face reddening as he saw Ava and Malcolm Winton on every major network. "Look at them," he spat, "playing the victims. I maintained order in my courtroom. That's all I ever did." "William," Calloway said quietly, "they have evidence of you dismissing alibis for black defendants, evidence of you ignoring exculpatory evidence, evidence of racial slurs in your private communications. The FBI is building a RICO case." "I can explain everything," Alderman insisted, but his voice cracked. "I just need to talk to the right people, make the right calls." "There are no right people anymore," Calloway exploded. "Nobody will take your calls. Your old friends won't even acknowledge knowing you. The system you thought you controlled is about to crush you." On television, Ava's voice filled the room. When he slapped me, I was terrified, but I was also angry. Angry that he thought he could get away with it. Angry that he'd probably done worse to others who couldn't fight back. Malcolm Winton added, "The investigation has already uncovered hundreds of cases that need to be reviewed. Hundreds of lives affected by one man's prejudice." Alderman lunged for the remote, shutting off the TV. His hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold his glass. The whiskey sloshed over the rim as he tried to take a drink. "I won't run," he declared, though his voice wavered. "And I won't take a deal. I'm William Alderman. I've been on the bench for 30 years. They wouldn't dare." "They already have," Calloway interrupted, picking up his briefcase. "If you won't listen to reason, I can't help you. But mark my words, William. The FBI will be here soon, and when they come, they won't care about your 30 years on the bench." The early morning silence shattered as FBI agents surrounded Alderman's mansion. Their black SUVs lined the peaceful suburban street, drawing curious neighbors to their windows. Agents in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI moved with practiced efficiency, carrying empty boxes into the house. Inside, they methodically went through filing cabinets, computers, and personal notebooks. Every document that could reveal Alderman's pattern of judicial misconduct was carefully cataloged and sealed in evidence bags. "Over here," an agent called out, discovering a hidden safe behind a painting in Alderman's study. Inside lay handwritten notes about defendants, filled with racial slurs and predetermined judgments made before trials even began. News vans screeched to a halt outside the property. Reporters scrambled for the best position, their cameras capturing every box and document being carried out. The morning news shows cut to live coverage, broadcasting the raid across the nation. Miles away, in a dingy motel room with peeling wallpaper, William Alderman sat on the edge of a sagging bed. The small TV flickered with images of his home being searched. His normally pristine appearance had crumbled. His shirt was wrinkled, his face unshaven, and dark circles ringed his eyes. The news coverage shifted to interviews with people he'd sentenced. A middle-aged black man, recently released after 15 years, spoke through tears. "He wouldn't even look at the evidence that proved I was innocent. He just saw my skin color and decided I was guilty." Alderman's hands clenched into fists as the screen showed Elliot Spencer, his former friend and ally, speaking at a press conference. Spencer's voice trembled with what seemed like genuine remorse. "I witnessed Judge Alderman's misconduct firsthand," Spencer admitted, adjusting his tie nervously. "He would routinely push for maximum sentences for black defendants regardless of the evidence. He ... Spencer paused, swallowing hard. "He would often joke about it in private chambers, saying he was keeping the streets clean." The motel room felt smaller as Alderman watched his carefully constructed world crumble. Each interview, each revelation, each former ally turning against him stripped away another layer of his denial. His phone lay silent. No one was calling to help anymore. The TV showed more agents emerging from his house carrying his personal computer and boxes labeled evidence. A reporter's voice narrated, "Sources say investigators have uncovered extensive documentation of racial bias in Judge Alderman's rulings, spanning his entire career on the bench." Alderman reached for the remote with a shaking hand, but couldn't bring himself to turn off the TV. He watched, paralyzed, as his life's work was exposed for what it truly was. Not justice, but prejudice wielded as power. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Patricia Chen prepared to deliver her ruling. Ava Winton sat between her father and Angela Martinez, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras ready to capture this historic moment. In light of the overwhelming evidence of tampering and false accusations, Judge Chen began, her voice clear and firm. "This court dismisses all charges against Ava Winton. Furthermore, the store owner, Mr. James Wilson, is hereby fined $50,000 for filing false charges and evidence tampering." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by muffled cheers. Tears welled up in Ava's eyes as the weight of months of fear and uncertainty lifted from her shoulders. She turned to her father, who was already reaching for her. "Daddy, she whispered, her voice breaking as she fell into his embrace. Malcolm Winton held his daughter tight, his own tears falling freely. "I never doubted you, baby girl," he said softly, stroking her hair. "Not for a single moment." The cameras flashed around them, capturing this tender moment between father and daughter. But for Ava and Malcolm, the world had shrunk to just the two of them, sharing this precious victory. Angela Martinez stood up, wiping tears from her own eyes. The reporters turned their attention to her as she approached the podium. Her voice trembled with emotion as she began to speak. "Today we witnessed more than just justice for one brave young woman," Angela said, gesturing toward Ava. "We witnessed a turning point in our justice system. Ava Winton's courage in standing up to corruption has sparked a movement that cannot be stopped." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "Because of Ava's strength, dozens of cases are being reopened. Corrupt judges are being investigated. People who were wrongly convicted are getting second chances. This 16-year-old girl did what many adults were afraid to do. She stood up and said no to injustice." Ava blushed at the praise, still held securely in her father's arms. Malcolm beamed with pride, kissing the top of her head. "This case has exposed the deep-rooted prejudices that still exist in our courts," Angela continued, her voice growing stronger. "But it has also shown us that change is possible when brave people refuse to back down. Ava Winton didn't just win her freedom today. She opened the door for countless others to find justice too." The courtroom erupted in applause. Reporters rushed forward, calling out questions, but Malcolm shielded Ava from the chaos, leading her toward the side exit. Angela quickly joined them, placing a protective hand on Ava's shoulder. "Thank you," Ava said softly to Angela, "for believing in me too." Angela's eyes welled up again as she squeezed Ava's hand. "You did all the hard work, sweetheart. You showed us all what real courage looks like." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the dingy motel parking lot as a convoy of black SUVs rolled in silently. SWAT team members dressed in full tactical gear took their positions around room 114, where William Alderman had been hiding for the past 3 days. Inside, Alderman sat on the edge of the sagging bed, his wrinkled shirt untucked and his silver hair unwashed. The TV droned in the background, but his eyes were vacant, staring at nothing. Empty takeout containers littered the floor around him, a far cry from his usual immaculate appearance. The SWAT team leader's voice boomed through a megaphone. "William Alderman, this is the police. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands up." Alderman flinched at the sound, his hands trembling as he reached for the remote to turn up the volume on the TV. The news anchor's voice filled the room. "Breaking news. The district attorney has filed multiple criminal charges against former Judge William Alderman, including obstruction of justice and assault." Before the anchor could finish, the door burst open with a thunderous crash. SWAT team members flooded the room, their weapons trained on Alderman. "Get on the ground, hands where we can see them," they shouted. Alderman's legs gave out and he slumped to his knees. His face, once mask-like in its authority, now crumpled in defeat. As officers secured his hands behind his back with handcuffs, news cameras captured every moment through the motel room's window. "William Alderman, you are under arrest," the lead officer announced, reading him his rights. "You have the right to remain silent." Outside, a crowd had gathered. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones extended as the officers led Alderman out of the motel room. His appearance shocked the onlookers. The man who once commanded a courtroom with an iron fist now shuffled forward in wrinkled clothes, his eyes downcast. His usual perfectly pressed suits and commanding presence were replaced by a defeated slouch and 3 days' worth of stubble. As the officers guided him toward the waiting police car, a protester broke through the crowd's murmur. "Justice is finally served," she shouted, her voice carrying across the parking lot. The cry seemed to pierce Alderman's fog. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting the cameras that had once captured him at his most powerful moment, and now documented his lowest. The same devices that had recorded him slapping Ava Winton were now broadcasting his humiliation to the world. The officers helped him into the back of the police car, his head ducked to avoid hitting the doorframe. a final indignity for a man who had once made others bow to his authority. The car door slammed shut with a definitive thud, and the blue and red lights painted stark shadows across his fallen face. The courthouse steps were crowded with families, their faces lit with joy and tears as they waited for their loved ones to emerge. Inside, Malcolm Winton stood beside Angela Martinez as the Judicial Review panel made their announcements, one by one overturning the wrongful convictions that had marked Alderman's dark legacy. In light of the overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, the head panelist declared, her voice firm and clear, "We hereby vacate the following convictions." As each name was read, sobs of relief echoed through the courtroom. Angela's eyes welled up as she watched years of injustice being undone. Beside her, Malcolm Winton nodded solemnly, his hand resting on Ava's shoulder. The courthouse doors opened, and the first group of freed individuals stepped into the sunlight. Marcus Thompson, who had served 3 years for a crime he didn't commit, ran into his mother's waiting arms. She held him tight, her tears soaking into his shirt. "My baby," she whispered, "my baby's finally home." More families reunited on the steps, their joyful cries filling the air. James Wilson hugged his young daughter, who had grown 4 inches while he was wrongfully imprisoned. Sarah Jenkins fell to her knees as her elderly father embraced her, both of them shaking with emotion. Angela Martinez watched from the top of the steps, her heart full. A week after Alderman's arrest, she had received the news of her promotion to senior civil rights attorney. The position would allow her to take on more cases like these, to fight against the system that had failed so many. "You did this," Ava said softly, coming to stand beside her. "You helped make this happen." Angela smiled at the teenager who had started it all. "We all did this together. Your courage opened the door." Malcolm Winton approached them, his usual stern expression softened by the scene before them. "Ms. Martinez," he said, extending his hand, "congratulations on your promotion. The Civil Rights Division couldn't ask for a better attorney." "Thank you, Your Honor," Angela replied, shaking his hand. "But this is just the beginning. There are more William Aldermans out there, more families waiting for justice." Below them, the freed individuals gathered together, sharing hugs and words of support. They had all suffered under Alderman's prejudice, but now they stood in the sunshine, free at last. Their families formed a tight circle around them, as if afraid to let them go again. Court officials moved through the crowd, helping with paperwork and offering guidance for the newly released individuals. The scene was chaotic but beautiful, filled with tears, laughter, and the sweet sound of families being made whole again. One of the freed men looked up at Angela and raised his hand in gratitude. She nodded back, remembering the countless hours she had spent reviewing his case, fighting for this very moment. The promotion meant she could do more of this work, help more families find justice. "Ready to get back to work?" Malcolm asked her, knowing the answer. Angela straightened her shoulders, her expression determined. "Always, Your Honor, always." William Alderman shuffled into the courtroom, his expensive suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his now thinner frame. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and his usual confident stride had become a defeated slouch. The same courtroom where he had once wielded power like a weapon now felt massive and threatening. The gallery was packed. Reporters scribbled in notepads while activists and former defendants watched with intense focus. In the front row, Ava Winton sat between her parents, her spine straight and her gaze steady. She had insisted on being here, telling her father, "I need to see this through." Alderman's eyes darted around nervously, taking in the familiar wood panels and the judge's bench where he had sat for so many years. When his gaze met Ava's, he quickly looked away, his face flushing with shame or anger. It was hard to tell which. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Patricia Reynolds presiding. As everyone stood, Alderman remained seated until his lawyer nudged him. He stumbled to his feet, the chains around his ankles rattling in the quiet courtroom. Several people in the gallery whispered and pointed. This man who had once commanded such fear and respect now looked small and pathetic. Judge Reynolds, a stern-faced woman with silver hair, looked down at Alderman. "William Alderman," You stand accused of multiple counts of judicial misconduct, assault of a minor, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. How do you plead?" The microphone squealed as Alderman leaned forward. His voice, once booming and authoritative, came out thin and raspy. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Ava's hand tightened on the bench in front of her, and Malcolm Winton placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Order," Judge Reynolds commanded, her gavel striking once. She turned her attention back to Alderman. "Mr. Alderman, given your former position as a judge, you understand the seriousness of these charges. The state has substantial evidence, including video footage, witness testimonies, and documentation of systematic bias in your rulings." Alderman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The chains clinked again, and he glanced around the courtroom, perhaps searching for a friendly face. But his former allies were gone. Even his wife was absent from the proceedings. The prosecutor stood, a thick file in her hands. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to present evidence showing a clear pattern of discrimination spanning over a decade. We have testimony from court staff, statistical analysis of Mr. Alderman's sentencing records, and of course the video evidence of his assault on Miss Winton." At the mention of the assault, several heads turned toward Ava. She held her chin high, refusing to show any sign of weakness. Malcolm Winton's jaw tightened, but he remained composed, every inch the Chief Justice, even in this personal moment. Alderman's lawyer rose to speak, but his client wasn't paying attention. Instead, the former judge stared at his shackled hands, perhaps finally understanding what it felt like to sit on the other side of justice. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, approached the podium with purposeful steps. "The state calls Ava Winton to the stand." The courtroom fell silent as Ava made her way to the witness box. Her navy blue dress and neat braids made her look both young and dignified. As she was sworn in, her voice rang clear and strong. "Miss Winton," Chen began, "please tell us about what happened in Judge Alderman's courtroom that day." Ava took a deep breath, her hands folded in her lap. "I was accused of shoplifting, but I knew I was innocent. When I tried to explain my side, Judge Alderman wouldn't let me speak. He kept cutting me off, making assumptions about me." From his seat, Alderman shifted uncomfortably, the chains at his feet making a soft clinking sound. "And then what happened?" Chen prompted. He ... Ava's voice wavered slightly, but she steadied herself. "He got angry when I wouldn't admit to something I didn't do. He came down from his bench and slapped me across the face, in front of everyone." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Malcolm Winton, sitting in the front row, clenched his jaw, but remained composed. "Miss Winton," Chen continued, "was this the first time you'd witnessed Judge Alderman's bias?" "No," Ava replied, her voice growing stronger. "Before my case, I watched him dismiss other black defendants. He wouldn't let them explain themselves either. He'd already decided they were guilty before hearing any evidence." The prosecutor nodded and turned to face the jury. "And how has this experience affected you?" Ava sat up straighter, her eyes moving from the prosecutor to the jury. "It showed me how broken the system can be when people in power abuse their position. But it also taught me that speaking up matters. After what happened to me, hundreds of other people came forward with similar stories about Judge Alderman. People who'd been wrongly convicted. People who'd lost years of their lives because he decided their skin color made them guilty." Alderman's face reddened, but he couldn't meet Ava's gaze. His lawyer scribbled frantically on a legal pad. "Thank you, Miss Winton," Chen said before turning to the judge. "The state would like to present Exhibit 47, statistical analysis of Judge Alderman's sentencing patterns over the past decade." As Chen displayed charts showing the stark racial disparities in Alderman's sentencing, Ava stepped down from the witness stand. She walked past Alderman's table with her head held high, embodying a strength that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Her father stood as she returned to her seat, wrapping an arm around her shoulders in a gesture of pride and protection. The evidence continued to mount as more witnesses were called. Former defendants, court clerks, and legal experts, all testifying to Alderman's pattern of discrimination. With each testimony, the former judge seemed to shrink further into his chair, his previous arrogance replaced by the unmistakable look of a man watching his world crumble. The tension in the courthouse was electric as everyone waited for the jury's decision. Hours ticked by like molasses, each minute stretching longer than the last. Outside, hundreds of protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Ava," and "End judicial racism," their chants echoing through the marble halls. Inside the courtroom, Ava Winton sat between her parents, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her father, Malcolm Winton, maintained his usual dignified composure, but his eyes never left the jury box door. The room was packed with reporters, their pens hovering over notepads ready to record history. William Alderman sat at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he once wore while presiding over this very courtroom. His face had grown pale during the wait, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he just stared straight ahead, unresponsive. At 4:37 p.m., the bailiff announced, "All rise, the jury is returning." The 12 jurors filed in silently, their faces unreadable. The forewoman clutched a piece of paper in her slightly trembling hands. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman replied, her voice steady. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The forewoman stood straighter. "On the count of abuse of power, we find the defendant, William Alderman, guilty." A collective gasp filled the room. Alderman's shoulders slumped. "On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty." Tears welled up in Ava's eyes as she gripped her father's hand. "On the count of aggravated assault against a minor, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in muffled sobs and whispers. Alderman seemed to collapse in on himself, his face ashen. The man who once wielded his power like a weapon now looked small and defeated. Outside, as word of the verdict spread, the crowd's chants turned to cheers. News reporters rushed to their cameras, broadcasting the historic moment live across the nation. "Justice served" flashed across phone screens and television sets everywhere. Malcolm Winton wrapped his arm around Ava's shoulders, pulling her close as tears streamed down her cheeks. These weren't tears of sadness or fear anymore. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of justice finally being served. The judge's gavel came down, restoring order to the courtroom. William Alderman, the man who had terrorized countless defendants from his bench, was now himself a convicted criminal. As the bailiffs approached to take him into custody, the irony of the moment hung heavy in the air. The corrupt judge would now face the very system he had abused for so long. The sentencing hearing began with a heavy silence blanketing the packed courtroom. Judge Rebecca Thompson, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, looked down at William Alderman with unwavering eyes. "Mr. Alderman, you stand before this court today not just as a criminal, but as someone who betrayed the very essence of justice," Judge Thompson began, her voice firm and clear. "Your actions have destroyed countless lives, torn families apart, and shaken the public's faith in our judicial system." Alderman, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his now gaunt frame, shifted nervously. Gone was the arrogant stance, the dismissive sneer, the air of untouchability. In their place stood a broken man, his eyes darting around the courtroom like a cornered animal. "Your Honor, please," Alderman's voice cracked as he spoke. "I've served this community for 30 years. Surely that counts for something." His plea echoed hollowly through the silent courtroom. Judge Thompson's expression hardened. "Those 30 years, Mr. Alderman, were not service. They were 30 years of abuse, discrimination, and corruption. Each case you prejudged, each person you silenced, each life you destroyed, they all lead us to this moment." She paused, letting her words sink in. "William Alderman, this court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison." The pronouncement hit Alderman like a physical blow. His legs buckled, and he had to grip the defense table to stay upright. "No, please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm 63. That's practically a life sentence." "As it should be," Judge Thompson replied firmly. "You showed no mercy to those who stood before you. Justice demands no less from us now." As the bailiffs moved to escort him out, Alderman's eyes wildly scanned the courtroom, searching for any sympathetic face. Instead, he found himself looking directly at Malcolm Winton, who sat straight-backed in the gallery, his expression solemn but resolute. Alderman paused, causing the bailiffs to halt momentarily. "This is revenge, isn't it, Winton?" he spat out, a final flash of his old arrogance surfacing. Malcolm Winton rose slowly to his feet, his voice carrying clearly across the courtroom. "This isn't revenge, Alderman. This is justice." The words seemed to deflate whatever fight was left in Alderman. His shoulders slumped, and he allowed the bailiffs to lead him away, the chains on his ankles clinking with each step. The sound echoed through the hushed courtroom, a final reminder of how far the mighty had fallen. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Jefferson High School as Ava Winton walked through its familiar halls. Her heart beat a little faster, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from hope. The corridors were lined with welcome back posters, and her classmates' faces broke into warm smiles as she passed. "Ava!" Maya Johnson, her best friend, rushed forward and wrapped her in a tight hug. "We missed you so much." A group of other students gathered around, offering hugs and words of support. "Thank you, everyone," Ava said softly, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "It means everything to have you all standing with me." Meanwhile, across town at the courthouse, Malcolm Winton stood at a podium, addressing a room full of reporters and community leaders. His voice carried the weight of experience, but also the lightness of newfound purpose. "Today, we're launching the Judicial Integrity Initiative," he announced, his hands steady on the podium. "This program will create an independent oversight committee to review judicial conduct and establish clear guidelines for accountability." The crowd murmured in approval as Malcolm continued, "What happened to my daughter should never happen to anyone else's child. This initiative will ensure that judges who abuse their power face immediate consequences." In an office down the hall, Angela Martinez was already hard at work in her new role. Her desk was covered with case files from across the country, each one a potential instance of judicial misconduct. She picked up her phone as it rang. "Yes, I can be in Chicago next week," she said, jotting down notes. "We've received several complaints about a judge there who needs to be investigated." Her voice carried the same determination that had helped bring down Alderman, but now it held even more authority. Back at school during lunch break, Ava sat with her friends in the sunny courtyard. The weight that had pressed down on her shoulders for so long was finally lifting. Her friend Tommy passed her a homemade cookie, and Sarah showed her the notes she'd missed in chemistry class. "You know what?" Ava said, looking around at her friends' caring faces. "For the first time in months, I feel like I can breathe again. Really breathe." Maya squeezed her hand. "We're just glad to have our Ava back." The afternoon news played quietly in the school library, showing Malcolm Winton shaking hands with community leaders after his announcement. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Chief Justice Winton's Judicial Reform Initiative gains nationwide support." Angela Martinez appeared on screen next, her voice clear and purposeful. "This isn't just about one corrupt judge. It's about changing the system itself. We're going to make sure justice truly means justice, for everyone." Ava watched the broadcast with a small smile, feeling a surge of pride. The nightmare that had started in Alderman's courtroom had transformed into something powerful, a movement for real change. She pulled out her notebook and began writing, ready to focus on her future again. The autumn breeze rustled through the oak trees as Ava Winton knelt before her grandfather's headstone. Fresh flowers adorned the grave of James Winton Sr., whose dedication to civil rights had paved the way for so many. Malcolm stood a few steps back, giving his daughter a private moment. Ava traced her fingers over the engraved letters of her grandfather's name. "Hi, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "I wish you could see what's happening now. Remember all those stories you told me about fighting for justice? Well, we did it. Justice won." A leaf danced past her face as she continued. "Dad says you never gave up, even when it seemed impossible. I understand now. I really understand." On the small television in the cemetery's administrative building, CNN was broadcasting a special report. In the wake of the Alderman case, 15 states have now adopted strict judicial oversight measures. The Winton Guidelines, as they're being called, require immediate investigation of any claims of racial bias in sentencing. The camera cut to various reform activists speaking about the changes. "What happened to Ava Winton opened our eyes," said one civil rights leader. "But more importantly, it opened doors for real change." Malcolm stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Ava's shoulder. She stood up, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," Malcolm said softly. "You know, he always said one person could change the world. He was right." Ava leaned into her father's embrace as the autumn sun warmed their faces. "I was so scared at first," she admitted. "I never thought standing up for myself would lead to all this." Malcolm turned to face his daughter, his eyes filled with pride and emotion. "You didn't just change your own life, Ava," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You changed history." Behind them, the news continued to detail the sweeping reforms taking place across the country. But in that moment, father and daughter stood quietly by the grave of the man who had taught them both the true meaning of courage and justice. The spring sun cast long shadows across the city sidewalks as Ava Winton walked confidently through downtown. Her steps were light, unburdened by the weight that had pressed down on her for so long. People occasionally recognized her, offering warm smiles or respectful nods. She no longer felt like a victim. She was a symbol of change. Clutching an envelope in her hand, Ava paused by the courthouse steps where she had once stood in fear. Now the building represented something different. Possibility. She opened the letter again, reading the words that made her heart soar. "Dear Ms. Winton, we are pleased to inform you of your acceptance to the Georgetown Summer Legal Institute for Young Leaders." Angela Martinez had written her recommendation letter, describing Ava as a beacon of courage who reminded us all what justice truly means. The words still brought tears to her eyes. "Just like your father," Angela had said when Ava shared her dream of becoming a lawyer. "The law needs more people like you. People who understand what it means to fight for what's right." Miles away in a cold prison cell, William Alderman sat on his thin mattress, his prison uniform a constant reminder of his fall from power. The small television mounted high on the wall played the evening news. His hands trembled as Ava's face appeared on the screen. "In a story of triumph over injustice," the reporter announced, "Ava Winton, whose case sparked nationwide judicial reform, has been accepted into one of the country's most prestigious legal programs. The young woman who stood up to a corrupt judge is now planning to pursue a career in law herself." The camera showed Ava speaking at a youth leadership conference, her voice clear and strong. "What happened to me was terrible, but it taught me something important, that we all have the power to stand up and make things right." Alderman's shoulders slumped as he watched the girl he had once tried to break, now standing tall, inspiring others. The remote control slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. In the dim light of his cell, he finally understood the full measure of his defeat. His power, his prejudice, his pride, all of it had crumbled in the face of a young girl's courage and truth. Back in the city, Ava walked past the spot where protesters had once gathered in her name. A small memorial plaque had been installed. "Stand for Justice." She touched it gently, remembering the day everything changed. The fear was gone now, replaced by a sense of purpose that grew stronger with each passing day. The acceptance letter felt warm in her hand, not just a piece of paper but a promise of what was to come. She pulled out her phone to call her father, knowing exactly what he would say. "You're going to change the world, baby girl, again." If you enjoyed the story of Malcolm and Ava, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.